Okay, so yeah, so I'm looking at terrestrial microplastics using birds as my biomonitor species. Um, yeah, plastic production has increased at massive rates over the past 60, 70 years. So from approximately 2 million metric tons in 1950 to more than 400 million metric tons in 2015. So on a global scale, we have a plastic pollution problem, basically, because of all that plastic that is produced. The majority of it actually ends up either going to landfill or is accidentally released along the way. So I thought I'd just give you sort of like a brief overview about plastics. So plastics are generally categorized based on their size. So you get sort of the larger plastics, so megaplastics, macroplastics, and mesoplastics. And then the microplastics and nanoplastics. So these are much smaller. And in recent years, there's definitely been sort of like a switch of interest to these plastics, sort of partly because basically there have been sort of methods that are able to detect and quantify them more easily, but also because of their small size, they're able to basically move around the environment in ways in which the larger pieces of plastic actually can't. So for the talk today, I'm basically going to focus on microplastics, as these are sort of my main research interest. So in terms of categorizing microplastics, you can get primary microplastics, which are sort of purposefully produced plastics, so things like microbeads in cosmetic products like toothpaste, and then secondary microplastics. So these are incidental plastics that have sort of been broken off from larger pieces of plastic. So where are microplastics coming from? So one of the main sources of microplastics are from factories. So that can be sort of purposely produced plastic, but also sort of like secondary plastics. And then once the plastic reaches the consumer, microplastics can also sort of be produced at this stage. Another key source of microplastics are washing machines. So when your clothes are washed, they basically release microfibers into the immediate environment, but also into the wastewater, which is something that I'll touch on in a minute. And another key source of microplastics, which is something I didn't realize until quite recently, was so cars on the road, when there's friction between the road and the tire, basically microfibers are released at this stage as well. So the next sort of main question is, where are they actually going? So I think when you think of plastic, I think the general sort of consensus is to think about plastic going into the ocean, into the marine environment. And obviously that does happen, but hopefully within the next few minutes, I can convince you that terrestrial microplastic pollution is also very much a problem. So actually, yearly release of microplastics into terrestrial environments may be 23 times greater than into marine environments. So once a microplastic is produced on land, basically they can be distributed within the atmosphere, and then during rainfall events, these microplastics can then reach the ground. Another key sort of source of microplastic transfer in a terrestrial environment is within the sewage. So once the sewage meets the treatment plant, the sewage is then treated, and in theory plastics are removed, but due to their small size, microplastics and obviously nanoplastics can sometimes remain within the sewage sludge. And then this sewage sludge is applied to agricultural land, and then it ends up sort of within the terrestrial environment. So what I'm really interested in is looking at birds and how they interact with microplastics in the terrestrial environment. So yeah, basically I think one key source of microplastics sort of entering a bird system is through ingestion of invertebrates. So a microplastic can move sort of on the ground or within the soil ecosystem, and then a worm can ingest that microplastic, and then in time a bird can ingest that worm and then also the microplastics. But also if there are microplastics in the atmosphere surrounding the bird system, they can be deposited onto the bird's feathers and also onto their nests. And finally, the birds themselves can actually bring microplastics into their nests and and even feed them to their young without knowing. So this can be sort of incidental, so they don't realize that there are microplastics on the material, so wooded material that they're collecting for their nests. But also they might actually be collecting probably larger piece of plastic for decoration purposes for their nests, so things like string. So where my research comes into it, I'm using a common garden bird in the UK called a blue tit. And I have 15 sites across Birmingham. And at every site, I have 10 nest boxes. And here's a picture from one of my boxes last year. So that's an adult blue tit sitting on a nest with probably some eggs in it as well. And so, yeah, in terms of sample collection, so from every available bird and its brood of eggs and chicks, I'll be collecting feather samples, fecal sacs from the chicks, and also at the end of the field season, I'll be collecting their nests. So here is a picture of one of my sites. I don't think it massively does justice to how nice some of my sites are, but anyway, yeah, so in the top left corner is one of the nest boxes. And as you can see, there is a lot of litter around and definitely some plastic there. So in terms of my findings so far, yeah, I thought this photo kind of like helped sum it up really. So basically something that I've come across a lot of my nests so far is this sort of like this colored material, and it's actually from a tennis ball. So yeah, all the orange around the outside is actually a plastic fiber basically. And in terms of how much plastic I found so far, basically I analysed my nest samples for macroplastics and found that 70% of those nests from last year's field season contain plastic. And so in terms of next steps, so due to disruptions because of coronavirus, unfortunately I couldn't do my field season this year and lab work has been put on hold. But my first step back in the lab will be to analyse my feather samples for microplastics and nanoplastics. And I'll also analyse fecal samples for those two pollutants. And then finally, yeah, looking at microplastics and nanoplastics in my nest material as well. And something else that I want to incorporate into my research next year is also surveying the area for invertebrates that are sort of a main food source for the birds, so things like caterpillars, and seeing whether or not they are consuming microplastics as well. So yeah, that's me done. Thank you for listening.